Hello again. My name is Paul Gilbert, and I'm offering a series of talks to look at compassion, the nature of compassion, and how compassion can help us through these times of crisis and tragedy. So today we're going to be looking at compassion in relationship to the body and the brain, and how compassion works in our body and our brain. In order to do that, I have to now share some slides with you, and that should be about right. Okay, so these series of talks really are looking at the nature of compassion, this whole concept of safe relating. And not only is it safe to relate, but the way we relate can be have very positive effects on our brain and our body, actually. And so today we're going to look at the body and the brain. So just to remind you from our last talk, talk 2, which looked at the nature of compassion, how it evolved, and it evolved in relationship to caring behavior, particularly between the parent and the offspring. And this is very important because in humans in particular, for a whole range of reasons, these systems are very well developed and tuned. And also it's very important to recognize that we as a species are a highly social species, and the way that we relate together has a huge impact on our bodies and our brains. One way of thinking about this is that the human brain is basically an information processing and information flow organ. So we're constantly sending information to each other in an interconnected network of relationships. So, for example, if I speak to you in a friendly, caring way, that will affect your brain in a very different way than if I speak to you in a hostile and critical way. So the information flow between us will have an impact on the way in which your brain is operating. So this is very important, that our brains are influenced very much by the communications and the messages that we send each other, and how we relate to each other is actually influencing how our brains are functioning in an interconnected field, really, of social relationships. So what's going on in the brain, what's going on in the body is really quite important. And what we know is that, and this is one of Spenny Spicken's books, who's written about the nature of compassion in human affairs, is that there's considerable evidence now that the way we relate to each other, whether it's helpful or hostile, can influence a range of physiological systems. Okay, so it's not just about being nice and having nice psychology, it has real impacts on physiological systems. So it actually affects genetic expression. So whether we grow up in a hostile or a friendly, loving, caring environment affects the genes that get turned on and off in us, and this is called epigenetic profile. Our relationships have an impact on our immune systems. They have an impact on our cardiovascular systems. They have an impact on our autonomic nervous system, which we'll have a look at in a moment. And they have an impact on a variety of processes in the brain, and especially, but not only, in the frontal cortex. So social relationships then can be seen very much in terms of the power they have on our brains and our bodies. So compassion is going to be a very major player in what's happening in our brains and our bodies. So the fact of the matter is that the evolution of attachment and caring behavior came and created a range of bodily processes within us that, when these are activated, they will organize our mind and help us deal with threat processing. They will help us deal with threats, as we will see, and they promote pro-social, helpful, friendly behavior and a sense of well-being. Now, it turns out that compassion stimulates these basic systems in the brain and in the body. So let's have a look and see what they are. The one that's most important is the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system, and this is called the autonomic nervous system. There are 2 branches to it. And very briefly, your sympathetic system is designed to activate various organs in your body and prepare you for action. Now, the action it prepares you for depends on the context. So it could be running away from a lion, or it could be partying or having a good time, okay? Activation is part of the sympathetic nervous system's job. And as you can see from this slide, it accelerates our heart rate. When we activate the sympathetic nervous system, we activate the heart rate, and it inhibits digestive activity because you're being active, right? And it stimulates glucose release and so forth. The parasympathetic system is its kind of colleague. It's not the opposing, but it works complementary to help regulate the sympathetic system. It's the kind of the braking system. It's the system that slows it down, slows us down. So for example, when we have our parasympathetic system working and operating, that has a tendency to slow the heart rate, to facilitate digestion. It stimulates the gallbladder. And these are all part of the body's ability then to start processing information and go into what is called rest and digest. So very briefly then, sympathetic system is an activating system and prepares the body for action. The parasympathetic system is a kind of a slowing system and is preparing the body for resting and digesting, as we'll see in a moment. Okay, so those two things are very, very important. And we can think about how does compassion help these systems become balanced, because as you can imagine, if you become very tense and anxious and angry, then the sympathetic system is going to become highly activated, whereas your parasympathetic system can help balance that. So what's very important then is this idea that the sympathetic nervous system is this activating system and the parasympathetic system has more of a slowing function. And the idea really is that we learn how to balance these functions. It's the balancing of these functions that is so important. Now, let's have a deep, closer look at what we call the parasympathetic system. And part of the parasympathetic system is called the vagus nerve, the 10th cranial nerve, the vagus nerve. And it's called vagus because it means, vagus means wandering, you know, and it means that this nerve wanders all over the body, basically. Now, this nerve, therefore, is very important, as we saw, because it has this slowing aspect to it. It's steadying aspect in the body. And we can see here that it has this impact on the heart and the kidneys and the digestive system and so forth. And when we look at what it does, when we have good vagal tone, we've got a good vagus, a good parasympathetic system working, this helps us to have calm behavioral states. We have good vagal tone, the vagus is working well, we can experience more positive emotional states. And we also experience lower blood pressure. It has an impact on our blood pressure. Now, it turns out that we can actually train up or tune up the vagus in a whole lot of ways, which we'll talk about later. But one of them is through breathing in a certain way. And in another video, I will be exploring with you various breathing exercises, which will help to stimulate your vagus, and that will help ground you. The vagus tone can also be stimulated by what we call mindfulness, and we'll be looking at mindfulness a little later on. And the vagus nerve is also very stimulated by friendship, by affiliative signals, voice tones, friendly facial expressions stimulates the vagus, because basically the vagus is sampling the environment for safeness. How safe is this environment? How safe am I with the people around me? Okay, so sending signals of friendship and affiliation sends signals to the vagus. We're safe here. We don't need the sympathetic system to go rushing off into threat. And so the vagus responds to cues of safeness. We also know that the brain responds to compassion. And my colleagues at the University of Queensland, this is from some work by Jeffrey Kim for his PhD, has been looking at a whole range of studies and how the brain is stimulated in different areas with compassion. The only side problem with some of these studies is that there's always two aspects to compassion. If you remember, there's the sensitivity, which can be associated with courage, but also personal distress. We can be distressed when we engage with distress, can't we? And then the second, the action component. So there's another element to compassion, which is when we're thinking of the wisdom of knowing what to do. But the reason I thought I'd show you these slides is simply to say that, you know, scientists all over the world are beginning to explore how compassion operates in the brain. What does it do in the brain? Now, this is very important because what we know is that we can begin to stimulate different areas of the brain when we know what they are because of what is called neuroplasticity. Now, neuroplasticity is a relatively new discovery. Certainly when I was training in psychology many years ago, won't say how many, but quite a few, it was believed that once the brain was pretty much formed, say in your late 20s or whenever it was, that was the end of the game. But we now know that is not the case. We now know that actually the brain is changing all the time, and it is growing in areas which are being exercised. So, for example, if you was to learn the violin, pick up the violin, and every day you practiced, an area of your brain that controls fine finger movement would actually grow. You develop more axons and dendrites in that area of brain. It would thicken up. That area of the brain would thicken up as you're practicing every day. And this is called neuroplasticity. In other words, parts of the brain can change according to how the brain is exercised. Another key thing that we now know is called neurogenesis. Now, neurogenesis means that actually, although we are losing brain cells all the time, and if you drink too much, you lose quite a lot, so be careful, we're also creating new brain cells. And those cells will tend to gravitate to areas where the brain is being stimulated. Therefore, we also know that if we practice compassion, we can actually produce changes in the brain. And if we practice compassion in such a way that it becomes a habit, a way of living, that's going to be really good for the brain. So we've seen then that compassion can have an impact on our parasympathetic system and the balance of the autonomic nervous system. And I'll be exploring that in more detail in another talk. We've seen that compassion has an impact in the brain. And we've seen that there are studies going on all over the world about where those are. And we've seen that we now understand that when we train the brain, we can change the brain. So this is very important. For example, a number of colleagues have been looking at, doing studies on exercises like practicing loving kindness every day, even just for 8 weeks, and have shown that you can get changes in the vagus nerve and in parts of the frontal cortex and change sensitivity in an area of your brain that's linked to threat, which is called the amygdala. The amygdala is linked to threat. So the point is to see that there is research showing that if we train and we practice certain kinds of images and visualizations and so forth, we stimulate our brain in a certain kind of way, we can actually change certain pathways in the brain. Okay, so that's important. And also, colleagues such as Tanya Singer's laboratory and various others around the world are showing that different types of training change different types of brain system. So if you train yourself with mindfulness, that changes certain areas of the brain. If you train yourself into empathy skills, which are very important for compassion, okay, but they are different. They will change different areas of the brain. And if you train your brain for compassion, that will have an impact on specific pathways. So this is extremely important for us to really appreciate that we're not just training in compassion because it feels good or it's nice to do. That's a good thing, but because these are quite physiologically very powerful, and that's because we have evolved to be a highly social species where the care and the understanding and the empathy and the cooperation we have with others has had a major impact on our physiological well-being. And this is important because, as I say, it also affects the immune system, which right now is a very important thing for us to be thinking about. There's something else which I think is really important. This is my last slide I wanted to share with you, that the brain and the body are much more connected, or we understand that they are much more connected than we used to do. For example, we now know that when I showed you the vagus nerve, there's quite a big link between the activity of the vagus nerve and what's going on in your gut, particularly the microbe environment of your gut. What's happening in your gut and your vagus are linked. We used to think these are all separate systems, but now we know they're not. Now, this is important because our diets can have an impact on how our vagus nerves works. Our diet can have an impact on how our immune system works. And we now know that, unfortunately, some of the Western diet is very bad for the vagus and the immune system, particularly high sugars, high carbohydrates. So if we're going to practice compassion, it's quite important we also try to create a body that will support the compassionate physiologies within us. And that means paying attention to your diet. And that's very important, particularly for our clinical staff who are rushing around doing the wonderful, marvelous work they're doing. So rather than relying on crisps and pizzas, we hope that the hospitals are making available a lot of fresh vegetables and fruits. They should be everywhere, really. So this is my talk then, to highlight the fact that when we are training in compassion, which we're going to be doing over the next few talks, that we are actually trying to stimulate different parts of our brains and our bodies. It's not just changing our psychology, we're wanting to change our minds right down to the physiological level. So in my next talk, we're going to be looking a little bit at how we can practice compassion to stimulate those systems in our brain and our body. So I'll see you at the next talk.